In today's episode, we dive into a tense encounter where things take an unexpected turn. When a female officer stops a driver for a routine traffic violation, what should have been a straightforward interaction spirals into confusion. The officer, clearly unsure, faces a critical moment when the driver refuses to provide ID. It's a situation that should be clear-cut, but the legal boundaries here become blurry, and the pressure starts to mount. As the conversation unfolds, we see the officer struggling with the basics of the law she's meant to enforce, raising serious questions about how well-trained she really is. With emotions running high and the situation escalating, will she find the right course of action? Or will her lack of legal knowledge lead to serious consequences? Stay tuned because in the next part, everything could change in an instant. As Ella sat in the dimly lit cafe, her fingers curled around the coffee cup, the warmth doing little to ease the chill creeping up her spine. It had been weeks since she'd received the first cryptic message, a single sentence scrawled on a torn piece of paper. Asterisk, you don't know the truth, but you will. Asterisk, at first, she thought it was a prank, some careless joke left behind by a stranger. But now, as the words haunted her in every corner of her mind, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching her. She glanced over her shoulder again, her eyes flicking to the figure near the window. It was the same person who had been there every day for the past 3 days, never speaking, always looking at her with an intensity that felt unsettling. Was it coincidence, or was she being followed? The bell above the door chimed, and the figure stood, slipping. The windows were shut tight, but a distant car alarm sounded off, its sharp wail only amplifying the tension that was building in her chest. The knock came again, harder this time, almost like a warning. She backed away from the door, eyes darting toward her phone. Ben hadn't called yet. The weight of the message still hung in her mind. Asterisk, you're next. Asterisk, the words echoed like a drum, each beat louder, more insistent. Her breath hitched as she made her way to the window, peeking out just enough to catch a glimpse of the street below. The figure from the cafe was standing at the base of her building, his face obscured by the shadows, but she could feel his eyes on her, even from this distance. How had he known where she lived? Her mind raced, thoughts clashing against each other like a storm, each one more frantic than the last. She turned away from the window, her eyes scanning the room for anything that could help her. Her father's old desk in the corner, the one she had barely touched since his death, sat there like a forgotten relic. A sudden impulse shot through her. If there was something, anything, that her father had left behind, it might be there. She rushed to it, her fingers trembling as she opened the drawer. Empty. The drawer was empty. Her breath caught in her throat, panic rising like bile. There was no time. Another knock. This time it wasn't a knock. It was a crash. The door splintered under the force of the impact, the wood cracking down the center. Ella stumbled backward, her heart hammering in her chest. A figure stepped through the door, tall and imposing, the dim light from the hallway casting his face in sharp relief. It was the same person from the cafe, his expression unreadable, his eyes locked onto hers with a cold intensity. Ella, he said, his voice low and almost soothing. Ben stood there, motionless, his body stiff. His expression was different. It wasn't just the blood staining his shirt. It was something more, something unsettling in his eyes. He was staring at her, but there was no recognition, no warmth. Ella, Ben said, his voice eerily flat. I'm sorry, I never wanted this for you. Before she could react, a sudden force slammed into her, knocking her to the floor. The world spun as she struggled to breathe, her vision blurred. She tried to push herself up, but hands gripped her shoulders, pulling her back down. Then she heard the last thing she ever expected. Ben's voice again, but this time it wasn't coming from him. Get up, Ella, It's time. The voice that spoke her name was cold, distant, yet familiar. Too familiar. Her heart skipped. This wasn't Ben. This couldn't be Ben. A second shockwave of realization hit her like a physical blow. She had been wrong. Everything she thought she knew, everything she had believed, was a lie. Ella's mind raced, a swirl of confusion and fear. She tried to push herself up, but the hands gripping her shoulders tightened, pulling her back down. She could barely catch her breath. The air was thick, suffocating, and every part of her screamed to escape. But where? The realization hit her with brutal force. Ben, the person she had trusted most, was not Ben at all. It was something else, something she couldn't yet comprehend, something far darker. The voice, cold and flat, came again. "You never should have come here, Ella." She snapped her head toward him, the figure who had once been her brother, or at least, who she had thought was. His eyes were hollow, lifeless, and the blood-stained shirt clung to his body like a second skin. But it wasn't him. The expression on his face, the unnatural calm, betrayed it all. Whoever, or whatever, was wearing Ben's skin was not her brother. She pushed with all her strength, breaking free from the grip, scrambling toward the doorway. She heard footsteps behind her, the heavy thud of someone, or something approaching. But she couldn't stop now. The truth was within her grasp, and she had to know it, no matter the cost. The door crashed open, and as she staggered into the hallway, her body collided with another figure, this time a woman. Tall, with sharp features and eyes that glittered with recognition. "It's you," Ella gasped, trying to catch her breath. "You've been watching me. You know what's happening, don't you?" The woman didn't answer immediately. She simply looked at Ella, her expression unreadable. Then finally, she spoke. "I've been waiting for you to see the truth. It's too late to run now." Ella's pulse quickened. "What do you mean? What is going on? Who are you?" The woman stepped closer, her voice barely a whisper. "I'm the one who's been trying to protect you, and the one who's been watching everything unfold. What you thought was your life, your family, was never real. Your father was part of something much bigger than you realize." Ella's breath caught in her throat. No, that can't be true. The woman's eyes softened for a brief moment, almost with sympathy, before the hardness returned. "Your father's death wasn't an accident. It was part of a plan. A plan that started long before you were born. The person you knew as your brother is just a piece of that plan. He was never who you thought he was." Ella's world tilted. Asterisk a plan. Asterisk her head spun as the pieces began to fall into place. The cryptic messages. The strange figure from the cafe. Ben's sudden, unexplained behavior. It had all been connected, but she had never been able to see it. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" she demanded, her voice shaky but desperate. The woman shook her head. "Because you wouldn't have believed me. And now you're too deep in. There's no going back, Ella. You've seen too much." Ella turned toward the stairs, the weight of the woman's words crushing her. But before she could move, a soft, almost imperceptible sound caught her attention. The man from the cafe, the one who had been watching her all along, was standing at the end of the hallway. His eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time, a flicker of something resembling pity crossed his face. "You didn't listen," he said, his voice low, almost sad. "But you will, soon enough." Suddenly, a blinding flash of light erupted, filling the hallway, blurring everything around her. Her knees buckled beneath her, and for a moment, she felt like she was falling. The world spun, everything shifting and rearranging in an instant. When the light finally faded, Ella found herself standing alone. No woman, no strange figure, no Ben, just an empty hallway stretching out in front of her. A single piece of paper fluttered to the floor at her feet, its edges burned as though it had been through fire. She bent down to pick it up, hands shaking. It was a letter from her father, dated a week before his death. She unfolded it, her eyes scanning the words. Asterisk, Ella, they'll come for you. It's never been about us. You need to trust no one, especially not Ben. He's part of it. You'll understand soon. Whatever you do, don't let them find the key. They'll stop at nothing to get it. Whatever happens, don't trust the shadows. Asterisk. The last line echoed in her mind as the distant sound of footsteps reached her ears. This time, they weren't just footsteps. They were closing in. And they weren't just after her father's secrets. They were after asterisk her asterisk. Ella's heart pounded as the footsteps drew closer. She knew she couldn't run forever. The letter from her father, its cryptic warning still fresh in her mind, urged her to trust no one. The shadows in the hallway stretched long and dark, but in that moment, she made a choice. She wouldn't be a pawn in someone else's game. With trembling hands, she pulled the letter tighter, turning toward the window. She had to escape, whatever it took. But as she looked outside, she saw the truth finally settling in. The world she thought she knew was built on lies, but it didn't have to define her. The key her father had hidden wasn't just a physical object. It was her ability to choose her own path. In the distance, she heard a final, whispered voice. It's not over, Ella. But she was already gone. As the night swallowed her whole, one thing was certain. She would face whatever came next on her own terms.